We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. And we began this just briefly last week. And it is now Paul making application and a further elaboration on what he had just said about his reward. And he's explaining why he's willing to do the things that he does. That's really been the whole chapter in a way. Is he's going back and he's explaining himself, and once again we're going to come back to the fact that he left chapter 8, and the last thing he said was that he would not eat meat again if that's what it took for the souls of others. So chapter 9 then is an explanation not just of that, but he elaborates and broadens it out to other decisions that he's made that had been criticized in different ways. And now we see why he grouped it in this way, because whether it was the fact he didn't marry or that he had not taken any kind of salary for his work there or support from them, that everything he did, he was doing what was in his judgment the best thing to convince souls to obey the gospel and for what was good for them once they did. That was his focus. And as he came to that, in verse 18, he did not want to take advantage of his position in any way or to give the appearance that he was doing so. And that is key. He can control his own motives and be fine. But he was also aware of how what he did, how it looked, how it affected other people. And he did not want to do anything at all to damage, ultimately, the growth and the spiritual development of the people he was teaching. So as he comes into verse 19, and we did briefly begin this, he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win the more." And this is a summary statement. He's going to now elaborate again. So this is essentially a principle of explanation as to why he does what he does. And it is, I am free from all men. That is, there's no obligation here. That's the key element that we looked at. That the point is that because he has gone into it in such a way that they're not supporting him, then there can be no misunderstanding as far as that this is some kind of, you're paying me to do this and give you this message. And that we've just got to, it's a financial exchange. We talked about that quite a bit last week, so I won't go more into that. But he wanted to make sure they didn't do this. So I'm free from that. Instead, he says, I have made myself, and this is, the word is, I've enslaved myself. And I really think in ways it would be better to understand this for all rather than to all. Because they're not dictating to Paul what he does. They are the beneficiaries of what God does, or what God tells Paul to do and he is doing, but they're not the ones that tell him. So he has chosen to take a role and a way and approach in which it's not about, okay, we're just having this kind of transaction, we're equals in it, and it's financial in that way. I've enslaved myself, and that is, I'm getting no profit on this at all. I'm not going to profit from this from you. And that's the real point he's making, is that I'm in my capacity, I'm acting as a slave that does not get any profit. If anyone gets profit, you get the profit, God gets the profit, but I'm not getting a profit out of you. And that core is really actually very important when we evaluate ourselves preaching, is that there are relationships you can build up, and there are all sorts of benefits that are not financial to preaching. There just are. There are the friends you make, that you get to spend more time studying. You get to spend your work and most of your time with Christians. That's huge. Most people don't get to do that. So there are all sorts of these things that are valuable intrinsically but not financially that go into this. But the key thing he's wanting to get across here is that I'm here to I'm under obligation to do what's best for you, that I might win the more. That's the last part. Paul is all about winning souls. He wants more people in heaven because of his work, and therefore, he's willing to accept less in this world if it means more people are in heaven. Okay? That's the core element of all this. And so it affects then choices. It automatically affects the choices. He's already demonstrated certain choices. Okay? 3 things: not taking something offered to idols, not eating meat offered to idols, not getting married, and not taking money directly from the Corinthians. Now, we're transitioning now, because he's in that principle. Now he's going to give some other general ideas that how this would play out, of what he has done, that are not specific examples, but that yet are important in type. And that's what we see beginning in verse 20. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who were under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Now, my first question is, what is the difference between these two clauses? Because aren't these the same group of people? You've got the Jews and those who are under the law, but those who are under the law in this context, are they not Jews? So why say it that way? What does each emphasize? Oh, you don't know either, huh? Okay. Okay, a little bit in that sense, but being a Jew, no, they're so close, and you could say in some sense that is the point. Is just giving it 2 different senses of it. He's going to expand in verse 21 in a different way in talking about Gentiles. The idea, though, in a sense, is both culturally and religiously. He kind of makes a slight distinction there. It doesn't affect much of what we'd say, except now I ask you, what would that have required of him? When Paul says, to the Jew I became a Jew, those who are with the law became as one who under the law, I became as one under the law, what change in behavior does that mean Paul was doing? What was different about it? He is a Jew. But did you notice it says he became to the Jews? That's interesting itself. It's no different. It's the whole idea for all of these things is it's a choice. In the choice he's making in the parallel for the Jews in this verse, and in the next verse to Gentiles, there is no distinction in terms of priority. That's important. He's a Jew, and yet he's not giving priority to his own cultural background. And that shows, if you read ahead and we look at verse 21, and it says, to those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, which we'll get to in a moment, that I might win those who are without law. So he makes, really what he's doing is by saying to the Jews culturally, but now we're going to emphasize the big difference, which is under the law, so he can make that contrast when he gets to the Gentiles next. So it's this really, really clever way, rhetorically, to get there. He, as a Jew, were there certain things that Jews did that Gentiles don't do? Okay, I'm glad we got a yes. Absolutely. Okay, give me now let's have some examples so we can understand the text, Paco. Okay, let's start with just Sabbath. Are the Gentiles going to observe the Sabbath? Do Jews observe the Sabbath? Yes. So there's an example of something that was both for the Jews, cultural and religious. something that went with the law that the Gentiles were never told to do. Hint, hint, for those that don't understand this difference here. Okay, they were never given that. So when he's around Jews, is he going to say, hey, bud, let's get up and go to work? Or in working with the Jews, is he going to say, okay, he's going to observe with them in terms of he's not going to work. Why? Because they might dismiss what he has to say out of hand because he's working. He's not keeping the law. They don't have this understanding yet. So what is he going to do? He's going to keep that from being a problem. And so what we have is, to the extent that he needs to, and there's nothing wrong with not working on Saturday. Right? Nothing wrong with it. You could observe that and nobody ever know it, is my point. Okay? So he's doing it for a very different reason, though. He is choosing to refrain from doing that on that day, specifically so that the people that he's with, who are Jews, he does not become a stumbling block to their listening to him. Now, the key element on all of this is he's never doing anything at all that violates the gospel. But to the extent that in culture or religious belief, because both of these are included here, that people might have false ideas about it, but that themselves in action don't require something that's wrong. You make the adjustment, you do, instead of insisting that they change everything. If it's not required and you're trying to teach them, you are the one, Paul says, I am the one who steps back and says, I'm not going to do that. Say that again. The diet was a big deal, yes. So is Paul going to eat a bunch of bacon and stuff around the Jews? No, absolutely not. That's off the table. Thank you. Okay. I was waiting. John. It's right below this. We're almost there. You're right on. That's correct. That's exactly right. Is it? He's getting there to the point of making sure that they understand, I'm going to be the one that makes these changes. So what does he do? I'm going to change my eating habits. When he's around Jews, he's not going to eat certain foods. When he's around Gentiles that have a problem with the idea that's been offered to idols, he's not eating that either. When he's around Jews, he's not going to be working on Saturday. Okay. He is well aware. Notice what this requires of us. It requires a high awareness of where other people are spiritually and taking the time to appreciate what qualms they might have with things we're doing. And it also means we have to be willing to step back from some things that are perfectly fine to do on their own, but that because of where somebody else is, I'm not going to do. Simple example now. Though so you can open up a can of worms, so I reserve the right to close the can at any moment. When you look at the whole idea about, in this country, about what is acceptable and how we view, say, Christmas. Okay? In America, Christmas is essentially a secular holiday, a national holiday that had religious roots. When you have Jews coming out with Christmas albums, that's when you know it's really not tied too much to the religious part, right? So that it's just a holiday. It has its own kind of thing to it. Okay. Now, but if you were to go into the Latin American world, okay, We get our students that are coming in from Mexico and from Costa Rica and from South America for the Spanish program. Those areas have been dominated for hundreds of years by Roman Catholicism. That basically created this as a religious observance. For them, it is very similar to the idea of eating meat offered to an idol. Not everyone probably knew that. Because it's so tight that in their culture, there's not that distinction that exists in our culture. So if you're going to do work, or you're going to try to teach someone that's coming out from that background, then you need to find some place else to do a Bible study rather than in your living room around the Christmas tree in December. Or in our case, November and January. Okay, so you have to find some other place to do that. Okay, so I want you to understand those are choices you have to make. A friend of mine went not there but to a different place, and it was none at all. I mean, you did not celebrate at all. That you have no evidence of it, and you did that so you could be able to teach. Because it's wrong to do? No, because if there's any misunderstanding about how people are going to interpret it, and it's not something that you're required to do by God, then the choice of making a sacrifice between this thing that I enjoy versus that person's soul should not be a hard decision. That's what he's getting to here. It's more important to win those who are under the law than to, okay, I'm going to keep this. I'm going to use this as a teaching opportunity as to why this small little thing is okay. They've got more important things they need to learn. Okay, so we need to be aware of that. In verse 21 then, it says it's the same idea, but we need to make sure and cover it. To those who are without law, as without law. Now this is a principle of comparison and contrast. And why he had introduced, okay, Jews, so you know who I'm talking about. But then emphasizing the law that they were following that would create certain kind of behaviors, such as Sabbath day and certain dietary practices. Now we're going to do a comparison and contrast to that of those who are without law. We mean Gentiles, but he gets it down to those who, they don't have those same practices. So he draws attention to where the schism is between the two behaviors that are very different. Okay? And he clarifies that in the middle, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ. So when he says this, he doesn't want you to think that he's saying they don't have any law at all. They're not under that law. And they don't feel like they're under a law the same way as the Jews do. The Jews had, historically, of course, from God, having had a law that they tried to keep to different degrees over their history. The Gentiles had none of that. So from their perspective, they did not have any of those kind of things binding them in terms of their behaviors and what they did. They were bound by the gospel, which is why he inserts this here. He wants to make sure you don't get the wrong idea. They do have a law. That law that they're under is the gospel. Side note, he's talking about teaching people. He's talking about Gentiles he's needing to teach, being under the law, which means someone who is not a Christian is still accountable to the law. They're not accountable because they obey. They're accountable, which is why they need to obey. Side note, if y'all didn't understand that problem cropping up, is that people are lost. That's why they need to hear the gospel. They're not lost because they've heard the gospel and didn't do anything. Believe it or not, that is a controversy in some places. That I might win those who are without law. So we've got Jew and Gentile in their different situations. The Gentiles now, they don't have a Sabbath day law. They don't have those dietary restrictions. Okay? Now, because of that then, what would Paul do when he was around Gentiles? Would he sit out and say, all his Gentiles, they're wanting to go, hey, let's go and be busy and they're out in the agora, and they're busy in the marketplace and doing things, and he's trying to make tents to try to make a living. That's where he talks to people. So he's just going to say, no, that's okay. I'm going to stay here because it's Saturday. Or is he going out where they are on Saturday to try to reach people who are out there on Saturday? When someone says, hey, let's go out to eat, I'm not sure where they went in these days, but have people over, is he going to refuse certain foods because they are not allowed under Jewish law? No, not at all. He doesn't want to offend them. There's no reason to. It's what Acts 10 shows. He wants to make sure, though, that they feel fully accepted, and he's with them, and he wants to have none of these things. You think about the people that says, okay, I'm going to go in, but I'm not going to eat your food. Now, sometimes you can get, my family, we understand there's some dietary restrictions, right? But it's kind of still hard on people if they don't know. Like some people can be offended. Oh, okay, you're too good for my food. No, that's not it. But Paul's awareness of this, he didn't have, that wouldn't, or any of his reasons. He had no problem with this food, and therefore he was not going to do anything that would indicate he had an issue with them because he was better than them because he was a Jew and they were Gentiles. Remember what he's trying to do. He's trying to bring them in to the church to make sure and emphasize that Jew and Gentile are equal in Christ. What if the very beginning point of this is he's making a big deal about how I'm doing this because I'm a Jew, and that this is, sorry, I can't help you over there. He's wanting to make the playing field, if you will, as even as possible so that they can concentrate on what they really need to be doing rather than any other kind of differences. People need to be aware of where the core areas are that are keeping them from being what they need to be. And Paul didn't want to clutter that all up. And sometimes we can throw a lot of things out in Bible studies or in life, or we do things that are very confusing to people who don't have the knowledge of the gospel. And we need to be more aware of how that could be confusing. Now, you're not going to be able to anticipate everything with everyone. But if you have conversations with people and you find out that there's some issues there, now it becomes, if you want to teach them, there's responsibility there. If you really want to teach them, of doing what's necessary to try to make sure that they understand. That is very different now than trying to just be like them. Okay, very different than having, okay, I'm just going to accept, and they throw these things out there. It's one of those things you say, oh, we'll handle that later. But I'm not going to let that get in the way of this. Sometimes what we do in teaching people is we don't really teach people, we just talk to people. And we have what amounts to a religious discussion, but not a Bible study. And that is, we're talking about something, but it's not really what they need to hear. I mean, you could have a discussion with someone at work over when Christmas began. Is that really the most important thing they have to learn for their life? No. No, not at all. So what we need to do is find a way to get past that kind of thing and to be able to concentrate on the things that actually matter. That's what Paul was doing. And he was doing it proactively. When he realized that in a general culture, this was not an individual thing, but within different cultures that just kind of, this is known. That's why if you're going to be a missionary, you need to spend time looking into that culture of what's understood, how people think, what's important to them, what things are off limits for them. Right? I thought one of the weirdest things I learned was that showing the bottom of your shoe in certain Asian cultures was a major insult to people. Where did I learn that? In an autobiography of Roger Staubach. Educational reading for the kids, y'all. Okay. preparation for him going to Vietnam. Okay, so it's an awareness. They are very much, if you look at what the military does, when they send people into, they'll have all sorts of preparation just for the culture those people are going into. Okay? Well, that's really what Paul's talking about here. Now we get to verse 22, though. To the weak, I became as weak that I might win the weak. I'm going to stop right there, and we'll get to John's statement here. Who's he talking about here? He's talked about Jews. He's talked about Gentiles. Who's this? It's a third category. Weak in faith entirely? I mean, wouldn't that be true for someone that's a Jew or a Gentile, that they would not have faith? Remember I said that context would come back? How would he describe the people in chapter 8? Weak. So he's now come back around once more to an explanation of what he originally was saying. And he's showing he's consistent in this principled behavior. That if he's going to do that for Jews and he's going to do that for Gentiles, he also does it for those Christians who are weak and struggling. He does not want to create a problem for them either. Why? Because he wants them in heaven. And he does not want, if you go back to chapter 8, to be the cause of stumbling that would cause their faith to sink and maybe fall away because of a misunderstanding. Now, that does not mean that there shouldn't be teaching on those issues. Certainly there should be. That's actually what he is doing in this letter. But he is teaching in the fact early on in chapter 8 that really these things offered to idol are nothing. It doesn't matter. But then he emphasizes how you treat people who are confused about that. And that matters more. And then he goes into this whole, so he has never fully left that discussion. What he's done in the same way that if you remember back in chapter 4, that he had applied all these things to himself and Apollos. Paul and Apollos weren't the problem. He flips it around and says, before you. You're the ones that have this misunderstanding the way you're treating one another or see yourselves. And so what he has done is he's applied this. He's legitimately saying, here's how I behave. But in doing so, he's showing the extent to which he was willing to go to sacrifice personal preferences, activities, things he enjoyed perhaps, because of teaching the lost and keeping the saved, how much it mattered to him. And this statement then, all of these verses we've been looking at, are what he means when he says, I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Verse 19 and the end of verse 22, they're both saying essentially the same thing with the explanation being sandwiched in between. It's good writing. He just was elaborating on it. He's telling you where he's going, of being a servant, taking on that role of I will do with less for the benefit of everyone else. Who all? Jews, Gentiles, weak Christians. Why? Look, and he says, look, I will make whatever adjustments I need to make within the framework of the gospel if it means saving souls. Now, how would you characterize that attitude by the Apostle Paul? That's correct. Okay, let's apply that now, Sandra. Is there are going to be a lot of things, particularly with new Christians, okay, in the week. Now, I want us to be aware of this when we're teaching people too, and I'll get to that in a moment. But let's start with just the language people use. I'm talking about like spiritual language. You got someone who's a new Christian, is really the first thing they need to hear is for every person here to beat them up over the head when they say pastor and referring to Eddie? Is that really the most important thing they need to learn? Okay. Now, do we need to try to teach that? Yes. You know what we also need to do? Is be patient with them. They'll learn it. You get that that's right. And so it's a matter of understanding that when you're having those discussions, they're going to use some different kind of language if they don't know better. No, there's sometimes what we can end up doing. I want you to think about the danger of this. We can force, shall we say, linguistic changes without accompanying heart changes. The heart changes matter more because the change of the vocabulary, that'll follow the heart. The heart does not always follow the vocabulary. Y'all see what I'm doing here? It's okay to say no. I have no idea what you're talking about, Kevin. No clue. Okay, Tanner? No, that's right. That's right. We have an outward appearance because that's what's acceptable. It's almost like they are shamed into it, but their heart is not. There's no conviction to it, and we end up with it's a shell of faith, and we're not wanting to do that. So that requires patience, discussion, and a lot of reassurance. So with every kind of correction, a little bit there's some reassurance too. Okay. And we need to appreciate this. This is at every level. Okay, I live in a world of where one of my main jobs is correcting people. Right, guys? Yeah, feels that way. For y'all, I mean, it doesn't to me. But it's important, and the key idea of, you know what is the best thing for reassurance? Everyone talks about, the sandwich method, right? And it's fine, okay? You know what's more important than the sandwich method? A relationship with that person. We'll try to let a method do the work that a relationship could handle many times over. Okay? So it matters to me more to have a relationship with my students so that they know me and that any correction, they know where it's coming from. More than just, didn't he say that nicely about how bad I am? Right? We don't need to be doing that to people all the time. We need to make sure that there's context for correction, a reassurance but of how much they're doing right and that we're building up over time. Okay, Devin? Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. I'm not telling that story. It's a good story, but no, I'm not telling that. Right. Okay, right. It's one of those things where, and the guys will get this a lot, so I'll give you to you now. We need to make sure we're dealing not just with what, but the why and the how. Why are we doing this matters. How we implement it is important because of, otherwise we just think that because we've changed our minds that we've changed ourselves. That doesn't happen until the how is in process, that I know what I need to do. So I can have the what, oh, that's wrong. Okay. Well, why? That's a far more important question in there. How? Now we're down to behavior. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to show you when I say that. This is why Paul was doing what he was doing, because he was forcing the questions back to being more than just an external matter. John, I'm glad you said that, because you know what most people think 1 Corinthians is about? It's about this horrible congregation with Paul taking shots at them like they're ducks at a carnival. Just boom, 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 boom. You don't know this, you don't do this, you don't know this, you're doing this wrong. There is all sorts of, the manner of correction he exhibits in this book is an important model. Because he's taking as much back as he can on himself while explaining to them what they need to address. And I think that was important for the relationship and to convince them. And we're going to see in verse 23, that's a professional segue, why. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. We're talking about motives now, right? He's coming down and saying, why, Paul, are you doing this then? If you say that that the eating doesn't matter, if you're saying you could be married, and if you're saying you could require us to provide you financial support, why are you doing all of this? Because of the gospel. But then he adds this, because hasn't he already pretty much said that before? It's because of the gospel. But in that way, it was because of them. Because of the gospel, to save them because of the gospel. Now look what he adds. That I may be partaker of it with you. And the partaker of it with you is hard. Partaker with you is actually a fellow sharer. It's one word. A co-sharer. A co-fellowshipper. Now the question is when he says that I'm doing this for the gospel's sake, for the sake of the gospel, well, what does that really mean? It's what the gospel wants done, accomplished. What does the gospel want accomplished? Salvation of everyone possible. So what is the end in mind? Fellow sharers. Co-fellowshippers. So when he says this, is he saying this in a way in which he's saying, he's already said he's doing it for them. He's also doing it for him. Because for Paul, if he's not doing everything he could, he knows he ought to do for the salvation of others, where does that leave him? Falling short. Now just stop and contemplate that. I want you to sit on that for just a moment. And if you think that's not what he is, then I suggest you read ahead for what we're going to study next week. Because that's where he's going with this. This is the transition statement from the section we've just been looking at as he's closing this off to talk about why are you so going to such lengths, Paul, for all this? Well, number one, I'm doing it because they need me to. you need me to. And also, I'm doing it because if I didn't do everything for you, when I know I should, then I fail. I fail God. I fail the gospel. And I fail you. Now, this is so different from the idea of rights. You can go and you look at, see, I don't know if anybody has a sermon, ever heard a sermon of the rights of a gospel preacher. I think I have one on the privileges of a gospel preacher. Now, do you have some obligations in that relationship? Absolutely you do. Cover that some other time. But right here, he's wanting to talk about this and saying it is actually more important to give up rights for the salvation of others than it is to insist on rights for yourself. Now, all that is, when we boil it down, is moving from selfishness to selflessness. Right? That's all it's doing. And you hear people and they'll say, well, that's a little extreme, isn't it, Kevin? You mean like the cross? We want to be different, but not that different. We want to have faith, but maybe not that kind of faith. We want to make sacrifices, but not those kind of sacrifices. So do we want to go to heaven, or just some kind of heaven? We need to really think about it and then evaluate. We will pick up there next week.